It's Wednesday, October 29th, 2014, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, a Freedom of Information Act request reveals the FBI co-opted the Seattle Times website to catch a bomb threat suspect. As you can imagine, editors there aren't too happy about that. We'll talk about Gamergate and how questions about misogyny in video games is turning into a debate about journalism ethics. And step aside Aaron Sorkin, we'll talk about True TV's behind-the-scenes look at life in a TV newsroom in the new reality series Breaking Greenville. And I have a few other things that I want to put before Mike and Ernest before the half hour is up. Let's start with the reporting on Michael Brown's autopsy. MSNBC host Lawrence O'Donnell went off last Wednesday night on the St. Louis Post-Dispatch's approach to reporting on the medical examiner's findings. The initial story, published midday Wednesday and then in Thursday's print editions, led to a flood of stories in other papers across the country that seemed to affirm Officer Darren Wilson's account of that day.
The Washington Post did not include an additional quote from the doctor that appeared in the Post-Dispatch. Quote, "If he has his hand near the gun when it goes off, he's going for the officer's gun." When I read those quotes in the Post-Dispatch, I was shocked by how far they reached beyond the facts of the autopsy. So I immediately invited Dr. Melnick on this program last night, which she agreed to do. And on the phone with our producer before the show, she immediately disowned those shocking quotes, didn't deny them. She said she was taken out of context, which is exactly what she said about those quotes on this program last night when I asked her about them at exactly the moment when the Washington Post pressers were running and locking those quotes into ink in this morning's paper. Now, I'm sure Dr. Melnick would have told the Washington Post the same thing about those quotes if either of the two reporters working on that false front page story had bothered to call her.
Yesterday, the Post-Dispatch added an editor's note to that story from last week, indicating that Dr. Melnick contacted the paper seeking to clarify her statements. When the doctor had claimed that her comments were taken out of context, as she says often can happen during long interviews, and she gave her opinion, but said she was making it clear that there are different interpretations possible based on what's in an autopsy result.
Well, so first of all, it's not surprising for a source when they become part of a firestorm to suddenly say, oh, you took me out of context, or what I really meant to say was, the Post-Dispatch has said it stood by its reporting. You heard Lawrence O'Donnell saying she didn't deny she said those things. I'm not saying that other media didn't take what the Post-Dispatch reported and shorthand it into the autopsy report defends the police officer's point of view. But that's not what the Post-Dispatch reported. What they reported is what she said.
I mean, the other issue here, I think, or maybe a larger issue here, is that this goes back to the partisan media that we've been talking about time and time again. And the public needs to be aware that you have the Post-Dispatch, which is trying to basically present the story as it is given to them, and then you have MSNBC, which has another narrative, that spin that it's going to put on it, as Fox News does, as CNN and others do. So, I mean, when you start talking about the actual news story as opposed to the talking heads on the other side, you're going to get a different narrative, and I think this is a part of that.
What would be really interesting to know is whether or not the Post-Dispatch recorded the interview with Dr. Melnick. If they didn't, they probably should have. If they did, my guess that might be behind why they're sticking by their story, because they believe that what she said is what she said. I mean, the other thing that interests me about this, though, is this whole notion of what's our responsibility when somebody wants to leak to us part of the information in a controversial story like this? The Post-Dispatch made it clear the grand jury did not leak this information to them. Somebody else did. But clearly it was only part of the testimony and the evidence that was presented to the grand jury. It'd be nice if we were going to have not selective leaking, but we could actually understand everything that went before the grand jury.
And I mean, that's a very important point to make there, Mike, is that you're only getting part of the story. And that part of the story is going to feed into a narrative that one side or the other is basically trying to put out there before the public. And in the case of this autopsy and what her comments were, that sort of works in with the whole narrative that Darren Wilson supporters want, and which goes against what some of the Michael Brown supporters want. No one's talking about when are we going to get the full story. And that's the key. What's the full story here of the information as it was presented to the grand jury? We won't know that until the grand jury comes back with either a no bill or an indictment.
And we might not know the whole story after that. I mean, one of the things that worries me is this notion that, well, the media are supposedly helping to prepare, as is law enforcement, prepare the community for the likelihood that he's not going to be indicted. Now, I can understand why law enforcement might have that as a goal.
Or Governor Jay Nixon.
Right, yeah.
We talked a little bit last week
others,
about the creation
I don't know
of
that it's the
commission.
media's responsibility to be selectively, to carrying selective leaks in print because they're worried about preparing the community for this or that outcome.
But the thing about it is the media has always covered stories like this from information gathered from various sources. It could be leaks, it could be official, it could be from wherever. So this isn't anything new. I think one of the differences in this is that there are various narratives that are playing out there on an issue that's much larger. And the issue is the criminal justice system and its relationship to African Americans. Right. And that, I think, is the overarching narrative that really needs to be discussed. And it's hard to do that when you have leaks falling in and out on stories and you don't have the full picture.
Yeah.
Okay, well, our next story is an interesting one that brings into question the relationship between the government and the press, and what happens when the government uses the press. It's an interesting one from Seattle. It all came to light on Monday when a technologist with the American Civil Liberties Union posted on Twitter that a San Francisco group had obtained documents proving the FBI had co-opted the Seattle Times website to catch a criminal. Here are the details. In 2007, the FBI in Seattle created a fake news story on a fake Seattle Times webpage, planting software on the computer of a suspect in a series of bomb threats to an area high school. The documents say that the FBI dummied up an Associated Press story about the bomb threats to look and feel just like the Seattle Times and sent the link to the suspect's MySpace account. Remember, this was all in 2007. When the suspect clicked on that link, the hidden FBI malware sent the user's location and IP address to the feds, leading to an arrest. The editors at the Seattle Times are incensed by this, saying it not only crosses a line, that it erases the line.
Well, they need to say they're incensed, and maybe they are incensed, but either way, I mean, they have to defend their credibility by going after, even though the story happened, 7 years ago,
yeah.
They have to defend their integrity. I think the important questions for me really is, the FBI had a suspect. What's unclear from the stories is if they had the name of the suspect and whether this was the only or the best or the most timely way to get that information. That's the only excuse I can think of for doing what they did.
And that was the first thing that I thought about was why, number one, why did they do this? Was there another way to do this? And I wonder if it was one of those things where, I don't know, somebody in the FBI office saw this in a TV show and say, "Hey, let's try it." I could see, I could see him doing that. But I mean, but then again, on a really important note is the media needs to sit down and talk with the FBI about this issue. We talked about the AP issue when they went in and to the AP's offices and tried to get information. There's been so much going on in which the government has done things that the media say, "Whoa, wait a minute, you're infringing on our First Amendment rights, our rights to do things." So I think this could be seen as one of those things, but I don't think it's at the level of some of the other things that we talked about in the past.
You raised it privately with us, Amy, before whether or not they FBI could have simply sought to cooperate with the Seattle Times or whatever, and they probably could have. There have been other examples. They're not exact parallels. I think of the Unabomber case, for example. But that wasn't an instance where the papers were being asked to falsify information or to try to deceive somebody. I just wonder, though, whether the media can have it both ways. I mean, let's talk about the last story we were just discussing. The Post-Dispatch and other media live on leaks.
Yeah.
Leaks from law enforcement. So when they want something, they're happy to have a relationship with law enforcement. But the Seattle Times was quoted talking about its independence from law enforcement. So when law enforcement needs or wants something, does that mean, well, our independence gets in the way of cooperating? What policy are you going to have as a news organization if you're being part of a community and not just seeing a sort of an adversarial relationship?
Yeah, I mean, when the media has a relationship with law enforcement on a daily basis, either to hold a story for a day or two, or not to run with a certain piece of information because there's a person out there that they're looking for.
It could compromise an investigation or public safety.
Yes, I mean, that happens all the
lines.
time. And it kind of goes back to what Mike is talking about. It's a two-way street. And I think part of it, too, when you look at what the Seattle Times said, I think a lot of it is for them to save face.
7
more
years is
so
a long
exactly,
time ago. That's got to be
exactly.
pretty embarrassing to that publication to find out 7 years after the fact that it had been used in this way.
Well, and frankly, just in the context of what's happened in Seattle, in the Seattle area in the last few days, I mean, lone wolf attacks on schools by young people happen all the time. And so if, and I say that, underline it, if this was the only or best or timely way to get that suspect before he might have carried out an actual bombing at a school, most people would say, then that's okay.
Ends justifying means in that way.
Ends justifying means. I mean, it's also one of those issues where, what if the FBI had gone to the Seattle Times and say, hey, we want to do this? And the Seattle Times say, okay, we'll go along with you. However, when this comes to light, we're going to have to basically talk about our independence away from you, as long as we have this quid pro quo.
There is an interesting point there. That could have all gone on behind the scenes that we don't know anything about.
Right.
Because you got to look good
To the
public and to other media organizations.
Okay, well, that is an interesting perspective to think about as we move forward. Last week, as time on this program was running out, we talked very briefly about a mess at the Chicago Sun-Times, about Dave McKinney. He's the now former Sun-Times political reporter who was sidelined after Republican gubernatorial candidate Bruce Rauner's camp tried to squash a story. McKinney explained his reasons for tendering his resignation right at about the same time we sat down to record last week's program. But his reasons are leading a lot of other journalists in that newsroom to question the integrity of its owners and of its management. McKinney likened his time away from the newspaper while this was all being investigated as being similar to being on house arrest, being told not to work, not to talk to anyone about the situation, was offered several other positions at the paper outside of covering politics that he looked at as though they were a demotion, having not been the position he had held for nearly 20 years. Now the guild that represents many in that newsroom is publicly showing support, and a group of newsroom employees have sent a letter to the ownership looking for explanation, for answers, and wanting to know that they have independence in doing the work that they're doing. Mike, you had mentioned to me that you had some sympathy reading through this and researching it, but that it's a whole lot more complicated than it might seem on the surface.
Well, I mean, the whole conflict of interest charge that was leveled basically against the reporter because his wife is a partner in a PR firm that handles a lot of Democratic politicians. I mean, I think that deserves more exploration than it's gotten. Nonetheless, this whole thing really smells bad. And the main reason it smells bad is that the company that Rauner, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, owned, or it was the company that also had a 10% stake, I believe, in the Chicago Sun-Times.
Reports, yeah.
And so conveniently, after the paper publishes the story and defends him against the attacks from the Rauner campaign, all of a sudden, he just gets pulled. And no, I don't think any reasonable explanation has been given for why that happened.
And the paper issued an endorsement in support of Rauner 3 years after saying it would no longer offer political endorsements.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think I said this last week. It's Illinois.
It's Illinois. Illinois politics are smelly.
Illinois politics,
are smelly.
And to say that the media is not a part of what happens in that dynamic is nonsense. And I think when you look on it, I think you brought this point up, Mike, the fact that he was pulled from reporting after all of this was going on in the background, and then to say, oh, no, there's no quid pro quo here. I mean, come on. It has to be, because there is no other reason to take someone who has that kind of experience in covering Illinois politics off of a very important story at a time when you're heading into an election.
Right.
There's just no other reason to do that. I can't think of anyone.
No, but I must say, if you look at it from the perspective of the candidates, you can understand why the Rauner campaign was really worried.
No.
I mean, go back and look at, for example, Rathergate and the fact that, here was CBS releasing a damning story about President Bush's, alleged problems with the Texas Air National Guard based on very questionable information a week or so before the election. Here, a month before, we have this story leaked.
But I'm not blaming the campaign. I think the campaign is doing exactly what it should have done. The problem I have is you're getting no explanation from the Sun-Times as to why they did what they did.
But I think there is an interesting other angle to this. I mean, Carol Marine, who's this legendary investigative reporter in Chicago at Channel 5, who was working with McKinney on this story. Here's what happened as soon as that story came out. The Quinn campaign cut up her quotes and her image and ran it as a campaign spot, an attack ad, and she can't do anything about that. Because legally, there is no recourse for a news organization to say, you can't use our likeness in your campaign ads.
Well, but to me, that's one of the reasons why it is still important for news organizations to have a clear line of demarcation between the business side and the news gathering side, because you don't run into these issues when you do that. And both sides know that what the news side does is strictly their responsibility, and on the business side, we're going to handle this.
So we talk about there being the need for that, but we've also talked on this program in the past about how some of those lines are starting to blur. We've taken a look at native advertising. We've taken a look at how sometimes as our industry is trying to react to increasing business pressures, that's not happening as much as we would want or need to see it happen.
Well, I think it's not, but I think it is still important to do that. I think there's a way that you can have more conversation between the business side and the news gathering side. But in certain instances, especially when you're talking about political campaign coverage, there needs to be clear rules about how that is going to be handled and who is going to have the responsibility on both sides.
Right, and I have called for there being breaking down this so-called wall or bright line between editorial and the promotion side of the house. But there are rules for different situations, and I think, as Ernest said, there are some places where the line still has to be there.
Okay, so here's another media ethics question to throw at you. While it may be considered media ethics, it might be considered a case of flat-out harassment. It really depends on who you ask. Gamergate goes back a few months. It started when questions came out about the ethics of video game journalists and their relationships with the developers who create the games that they review. Those on one side of the fight will tell you it's a bunch of right-wing white men who don't want the gaming community to expand to include women or minorities. Those on the other side will tell you it's a fight to end misogyny and racism, both in video games and how they're covered. There's no question that the video game journalism market is a very niche market. It's very much targeted. But this fight has now turned mainstream.
Yeah, it's funny. The first time I heard this was on an NPR story. I was sitting at the light, getting ready for the light to turn, and I'm listening to the story, not paying attention to what's going on. And there are people blowing their horn because I just could not believe some of the things that's been going on in this whole conversation, which has really turned
almost violent. There have been death threats against women in terms of fighting against this misogyny in video games and video game journalism.
And in a lot of ways, it goes back to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about what happens on the internet, the comments and the blogs,
trolls.
And it's the trolls, and it's a lot of this. There is at least according to what I've been reading, a concerted campaign on the part of some in the gaming world to basically drive out by any means necessary these women and others that they feel are somehow trying to diversify, for lack of a better word, the gaming industry. I don't understand it.
I can understand to a point this notion that there is a problem with the ethics of journalists covering the gaming industry. I mean, it's true. I mean, there's a real tight connection sometimes between the gaming companies and the gaming journalists, and it's all about money.
And we've said the same thing about sports in the past.
We said that about sports. We've said it about technology and different, fanboys that cover Apple.
Right.
But there was a really interesting analysis, and I'm trying to remember, was it the Washington Post, Newsweek that did the analysis? We've got a link on our blog about it. And they looked at the tweets on Gamergate, and basically the vast majority of tweets are aimed at these women developers, not at the journalists, and they're basically these sort of misogynistic attacks, these threats, So maybe it is just a few trolls that are doing it, but somebody needs to clean up the act, or this campaign is going to get away from those folks who say it's about,
And that's the point I want to make. The people, those who are saying that it's about gaining credibility, they need to be the ones to lead the charge to end this. I mean, we had it on our Links blog. So one of them is saying that this could end in a week. Well, let's end it. It needs to end.
Because this has been going on more than 2 months at this point. There was one analysis that showed there has been more than 1 million tweets out there that use that hashtag Gamergate and talking about that.
Well, and as we were saying briefly before, I mean, I'm not in the gamer demographic.
Neither am I.
I had no idea that this was going on until you brought it forward. And really, at first,
I play solitaire.
The only reason I looked at the story was because of the incredibly nasty things that are being said, and there was, so obviously the message has gotten away from the people who claim that it's about ethics. So there was a great quote on one of the pieces you found. Martin Bellamy, who's a reporter at the Mirror, said, "It's one of the ultimate ironies of Gamergate that after years of trying to explain to the media that mass school shootings shouldn't be linked to violent video games, that violent video game fans are threatening school shootings to silence women." I mean, that's the message that's coming through from this whole thing.
So, I mean, they can't fall back on, well, video games have nothing to do with the violence that we see in everyday life. Not when you're actually seeing it in their words.
The audience is making those threats.
Exactly.
There. Well, what would you consider to be the benchmarks of breaking news coverage? Wall-to-wall coverage with anchors repeating the same sparse details over and over again, speculating on what they could mean, what could be happening, who may be involved. Seems we got schooled last week when a gunman opened fire at the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. Take a listen as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Peter Mansbridge guides viewers with credibility and a sense of calm that most of us aren't accustomed to.
So a situation that is, as we say, tense and unclear. And it's on days like this, we keep reminding you of this, and it's important. It's on days like this where, the story takes a number of different pathways, a number of changes occur, and often rumors start in a situation like this. We're trying to keep them out of our coverage, but when they come sometimes from official sources, like members of Parliament, you tend to give them some credence, but you carefully weigh it with what we're also witnessing. It's clear the situation is not over. It is clear that police are in a tense standby situation and continue to be on the lookout. And until somebody blows the all clear on this, we will continue to stay on top of it and watch as the events unfold.
The situation in Ottawa last week wasn't that much unlike what we've seen here during the Boston Marathon bombings, during any number of school shootings, during plane crash coverage. But what we saw in that 53-second clip, it felt very different than anything we would ever see in wall-to-wall coverage on networks here.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say anything we'd ever see. I mean, it reminded me a lot of some of the coverage that you saw at 9/11. Okay. Where the network anchors were very calm about the way in which they approached it. Since that time, we've
that was 13 years ago.
That was 13 years ago. In that 13-year span, we've gone from that to what happened in the Boston Marathon bombing, where you had speculation being thrown around, people on the air saying things that they hadn't confirmed. And I think we need to go back to this kind of coverage, because I think this is one of the things that sort of calms the public, takes away the fear, and brings fact and knowledge to the story, as opposed to rumors and innuendo.
Can we put that genie back in the bottle, though, 13 years after the fact? Is style and is what has become, I don't want to use the word acceptable, but what we've become used to has changed so much?
I mean, it probably isn't going too far to say that maybe Canadians are just kinder, gentler, more restrained people than
that's true.
We are in the U.S. And their TV, the environment is a lot different there than it is here. I mean, we all know what our cable TV landscape looks like and all the jockeying and the different political positions that are taken. But there were some pretty outrageous headlines that ran on the websites of all of our media organizations compared to the restraint the Canadians were showing. I'll say one other lesson I took from it, though, Amy, that maybe is not so obvious. The CBC is a publicly financed news organization. Sure. They have their financial problems just like public media do in this country, but it's a much more robust level of support than we have here. I mean, we don't have PBS, for example, out there doing their own 24-hour spot news coverage the way the CBC does. Maybe if they did, we'd get that kind of a viewpoint to compare to the CNNs and the Foxes and the MSNBCs.
I mean, I think Mike makes a good point. I think we sort of, our media sort of plays to the audience, and it's kind of hard to turn that off when you get into a situation like this, when you're doing the sort of shout fest back and forth on a 24/7 environment, and then something like a school shooting happens, it's kind of hard to say, okay, we got to go to this thing here.
We need to be controlled, and we need to
exactly.
Bring this back. Well, from the good to the bad to the potentially ugly, you may have heard that the True TV network has plans for a new reality TV show, Breaking Greenville. It's set to premiere in December and show what it looks and feels like to work in two competing newsrooms in Greenville, Mississippi. Here's an excerpt from the show's trailer, now up on YouTube.
Stand by, we got about 15 seconds.
5, 4, 3, 2, opener.
Welcome back to Good Morning Mississippi. We have breaking news this morning. What happened?
It looks like we're having technical difficulties.
Well, that didn't go very well.
Trailer on our links blog. I promise you're going to laugh at least once. You're going to cringe too. Mike, you told me you can't wait. You're about to set your DVR.
I've got a note on my calendar when I get home to set my DVR to record this because, I mean, the trailer is both hilarious, and we've been in local newsrooms and know that this could be very true. I mean, they're comparing it to The Office, except with real people. Now, when you talk about reality TV, though, what does real really mean? I mean, I'm sure that these characters have been coached. It's going to be edited to carry this narrative through. But, I mean, they've got some crazy characters. You see one guy out there with a story where they're blowing up a beaver dam. And you've got the news director of one station who's the Oprah of the South, as she calls herself, who does motivational training on the side. You couldn't script that.
If you could only at home right now on the radio see the look on Earnest Perry's face, he's not nearly as enthused as Mike is.
I'm not a huge fan of reality TV, and watching this clip basically confirmed why I shouldn't be watching it, because I laughed a little bit, but most of the time I can't believe they're actually putting this on the air, and I'm wondering how long it's going to last. So I'm just sort of speechless. It's the worst. It's the worst of media humanity. Is probably the best way to put it.
But any publicity is good publicity if you're those stations.
Okay, well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today. Check out our links blog. It's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments or questions. See previews of what we'll be talking about next week and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Kendrisa Cockrell and Hope Kerwin are our associate producers. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.